You're listening to an AINC original podcast. We believe you don't have to do life without a compass. Let us be your guide on this amazing journey. Welcome to Navigating Life with Vision Loss.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for NLVL. I'm your host, Kim Wardlow. We are wrapping up our month of emergency preparedness in October, and Monika Weber had joined us for two different episodes. One talking about just preparation of like a kit and making your plan and doing those things, and then the second episode with her talked about when an emergency hits, like things you need to think about as if you need to navigate outside of your home and get to somewhere safe. And so a little bit more detail on the plan and implementing that plan when you need to evacuate. So we talked about evacuations. And this time, Monika is joining us again. She's the emergency management coordinator here in Boulder County, but she's being joined by Ryan Airey, who is a senior program coordinator with the Recovery and Resiliency Division in the Office of the County Administrator. Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about your role in disaster management and how it intersects with the work that Monika is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kim, and thanks for having us. So I'm a senior program coordinator in our Recovery and Resiliency Division. I work on longer-term recovery plans and programs that we offer at the county here for longer-term recovery activities. So once, the disaster strikes and people are starting to get ready to rebuild both, public infrastructure and private infrastructure, my team will set up programs to help facilitate that work.
Great, thank you. So we talked last time about evacuation. So once an evacuation has happened and a person or family has been able to, leave their home and get to a safe place, what are the next steps that they should be thinking about or support services that they should be looking into after they've evacuated and, they're in a place of safety?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one. With evacuation, one of the things that we talk about is planning ahead for having a place to go that might be family or friends, but if that's not an available option, something that folks can do is go to one of the shelters that exist. And so no matter where you live, typically if there's evacuations in place, a shelter for folks to go and stay at if their home is compromised, damaged, whatever might be the case, will pop up. And that's staffed either by local officials. Red Cross will help out with that at times. But that's a location then where folks can stay, sleep, there's meals provided, and then some information. Something that folks should expect at that location is it's not going to be the full recovery mode of all the information about what you might need to do. That comes later on with a disaster assistance center, but is kind of that first landing point that folks can go to just to have a safe place to stay, whether that's overnight or just as they kind of get their bearings and decide what's next for them. Okay.
And are the shelters, are they accessible? If a person has vision loss or is blind, are they, how difficult are they to find? I'm just thinking if you're in an emergency situation, are those posted ahead of time so people could identify, like if they needed an emergency shelter, like where the nearest one would be?
Yeah, it depends. I think for our community in Boulder, we typically use kind of a few of the same locations consistently when we have disasters, depending on where the disaster is located. So something that could be a good planning effort if you are here in Boulder County or another community is if you're not sure where those spots normally are, reach out to your local officials to say, are there locations that are typically used? That way you can kind of have that in your wheelhouse of places you know that you might head and can maybe familiarize yourself with that location ahead of time. But they all should be accessible. We have a due diligence to provide that to our community. And if you find that you arrive at one and there's components that aren't meeting a need you have, definitely talk with shelter staff about what accommodations you need to make that a safe place and a comfortable place for you to be. So that'd be my advice on kind of navigating that, but certainly reach out, because some communities have those plotted out where it's always going to be one of, X number of locations. Others, it might vary depending on kind of what their personnel and staffing looks like and what locations are available. So.
Yeah, and I would just tag on to that as well, Monika. Once the shelters close and we start getting into more of a recovery posture, we'll open up the Disaster Assistance Center. Maybe FEMA will be co-located with their Disaster Recovery Center in the same physical building. But those physical building, they're accessible facilities, and we're there to ensure that people can access the information that they need in multiple different formats, so that we're ensuring that we're providing an equitable environment for everybody.
Okay, that's great. What should a person expect? I know I've never had to go to an emergency shelter before, but what should they expect if a person does need to go and stay for some period of time at an emergency shelter?
Yeah. With that, it'll usually be in some kind of community type of facility. So whether that's a community center or sometimes schools, gymnasiums, and it is kind of a communal living environment. So from the experiences that I've seen, and it may vary depending on the circumstance, but it's kind of a cohabited space. So everyone's sleeping potentially in kind of the same quarters. Meals are provided. Again, there's some information that might be shared, but not to that level at the recovery phase yet. But that's what that environment is kind of like. And Ryan, you might be able to add on having more depth of experience in Boulder County and other places with this, if there's any other nuances about kind of environment at shelters.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Monika. It's a co-located environment. Generally, what we see at shelters there's cots lined up in a large room where we can fit as many people as needed to make sure that their safety and security is ensured while they're there until we can kind of figure out what's next. It's unfortunately it's not the Ritz-Carlton, but it's a safe environment for people to go if they don't have another place to be.
I was going to say, I'll add on to that too, that for folks that might have service animals are always allowed in shelters, but if you have other pets, those aren't necessarily always allowed. So that differentiation between service animal and then pets being different. And that's shifting depending on the shelter location. But just knowing that for folks, if you do have pets that aren't service animals, planning ahead for them can be helpful. One thing I know that we have locally is we have agreements with our local animal shelters who then clear out sections of the shelter so folks can take pets there, not to be rehomed or anything, but rather just as a safe holding place for them, so that post-disaster, while they kind of get on their feet, figure out where they can be and have that regular pet with them, that they have time to be able to sort that out. So that is an option as well that exists for folks if you have a non-service animal and you need to find somewhere for it to be if you need to be in the shelter location.
Right. And we did talk in the previous episode about when you're preparing like a go bag for yourself, if you have a service animal, to be sure you're taking food and things for them as well.
Exactly.
So that you can be in a shelter environment, because I know they provide food for the people, but I'm not sure they provide food for animals, since typically it would only be the service animals allowed.
I would say there can be food at shelters for pets as well.
Okay.
If you have a service animal. So that's something typically in that shelter environment, we try to make sure that we're meeting the needs of whoever might land there, right? And so if you have a service animal, but we're like, goodness, I had to leave too quickly, didn't grab these things, we will do work to make sure that we're meeting those needs.
Okay, that's great.
And we've seen in past activations where There have been generous donations from the community for food, whether it's cat food, dog food, etc., that folks could use while they're in the shelters or displaced elsewhere. And that's been a great resource.
Yes, the community seems to be so generous when these disasters happen in trying to help folks that have been displaced, which is always
Absolutely.
just heartwarming to see. And I'm sure if someone arrived that was blind or low vision, and if they didn't have friend or family members with them, like somebody could help them know like what cot is available and those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
So then the other possibility, we have the evacuation, and we've talked about planning for that and going to a shelter, but sometimes that's not what folks are told to do, or that's not the most advisable thing to do. And we're told to shelter in place. So how does that differ in terms of the preparation? If you need to prepare your home, if you need to stay in place during an emergency?
Yeah, with sheltering in place, there's a couple ways that we typically think about that. And one of which is a true like kind of order to shelter in place for your safety. The other are sometimes just situational. We happen to end up in place, whether it's ordered or not, right? Mm-hmm. And so the first one might be for something like active harmer or a hazardous materials release, where you need to stay indoors so that you're not breathing in or otherwise exposed to a danger or a hazardous chemical or substance, right? So that's kind of one side, and prepping for that in some ways looks similar to the second kind of bucket that I'll talk about, which is not a ordered shelter in place, but rather if we have blizzard, power outage, times where people aren't necessarily saying, oh, I'm going to go drive around and, I'm just going to joyride with some friends out and about. So in those situations, it's really looking at both of them kind of result in the same thing. You feel stuck at home to some degree, right? But with that, it's kind of assessing what is the risk that I have, or what are the things that I need to sustain myself in this environment for whatever reason you're, stuck inside. I think for the latter half that are more of the kind of weather-related shelter-in-place sort of things where it's a chosen thing.
That's probably the more frequent.
Yes, absolutely. It's looking at, do you have access to backup power? If you don't and you have devices, medications that need to stay at a certain temperature, anything like that that would need that to support your well-being and safety. Think about what sources could you use for backup power, or remembering that you don't have to be in it alone. So there might be resources like neighbors, friends, or even when we had public safety power shutoffs where kind of day shelters opened up. So it was a place that people could go charge devices or be able to plug in to access those devices that they needed. So that's kind of one way to look at it. And then kind of on the power outage theme as well, thinking about if you're in an environment like that where you don't have power to necessarily cook or keep food at a safe temperature, like what are things you can do to work around that, right? And so having things on hand, it might not be your favorite meal ever, but do you have dried goods, whether that's, peanut butter sandwich or a can of beans or whatever fits your dietary needs, but having those things available so that you can safely eat something and not become ill, and then also safely store it afterwards if you need to store it. So you don't have to worry about that. And with power outages, also thinking about lighting, again, things that might help you if you're low vision, and that low lighting is going to cause even more difficulty with that, having those resources around that might help you. And I've worked places where even kind of protocol, and we use once the power goes down, someone in that building knew we attach glow sticks to certain key points as a way to kind of serve as a aid or guide for folks. So that could be, a physical thing that helps you navigate for low vision, and then using the normal ways that you would navigate around otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And I could see too in mountain communities, and I think they're maybe more used to doing this type of preparation because they get more snow and get stuck a little bit more often. But you also don't necessarily have neighbors and people as close to you if you're out in those more rural areas. So to be sure that you can be self-sustaining for a while. Yeah, planning ahead, even things like heat for folks that might be more sensitive to that. If if it gets really cold, you're going to have kind of exacerbated issues, whether that's, joint pain, other things that occur, thinking about
is there a room in your house that you can designate and kind of insulate better in terms of, great, shut the doors and windows there and try to keep the heat in one room, use a fireplace, things like that, that help. And planning ahead. So if seems like the power might go out or we have a blizzard, if it's accessible to you and you know that you might be really isolated and don't feel comfortable with that, chatting with friends, family, other folks to say, if we get into this environment, maybe we all stay together, right? Whether they come to you or you go to them, because then that just gives you more support system. And for them, they might be feeling the same exact way of like, gosh darn it, I wish someone else was here. And you might be that someone to them. So just keeping that in mind as you plan with that support system.
Right. And can a person, I'm thinking particularly folks that have disabilities, can they expect that there will be any support from the outside, from resources that might typically come to your aid? But if we're in a snowstorm or something, if there's possibility of that, or, that those folks, they get out there, but they also have to think of their own safety as well.
Yeah, I would say typically like aid, if you call, aid will come. It depends, I think, when we look at some of the additional hazards that get stacked on top of that, right? It might take them longer and there's no way for them to get around that. If we've got, blizzard conditions, it's going to be slower going, or getting snow plowed to be able to access certain roads can be more challenging. So knowing that help might come, but it might be more delayed than normal. So just kind of having that and prepping for, okay, I might be stuck, instead of being here for a few hours. If I call for help, it might be more than that, or a day, or kind of just taking that into your kind of planning assumption so that you can make sure you're as prepped as you can be within your means, to be able to work on a more elongated timeline than normal.
Yeah, that's definitely something to keep in mind, because they're facing the same issues out there.
Yeah.
And I will say, just to add to that, Monika, in past experience where we have an active incident ongoing, when the 911 center is getting flooded, our first responders will prioritize vulnerable populations as well to help with evacuations and so forth, if we know that that situation exists.
That's good to know. And is there any way for folks to let responders know that ahead of time? Is there any sort of, like, I know you can sign up for notices that you get on your phone and things. Is there the reverse of that to let them know that there's someone that's within that more vulnerable population that might need help?
Yeah, I will say, Ryan, you might be able to speak to this. I think responders typically, because they're pretty well versed in their communities, kind of know, okay, here are locations, especially if it's more congregate care settings, that, hey, we know we might need to put extra effort here to help folks get out. I would say the kind of letting, a fire department or law enforcement know is something that doesn't typically happen. And the reason that ahead of time there's no kind of registry or list is because really trying to stay away from giving folks the false sense that, like, you're on this list and so someone will come get you. The reason for that being those kind of registries are hard to maintain, and the accuracy, like, you might have a condition change in your life where now maybe they know about one component but not another piece. And so I would say the best thing to do is, like, if you find yourself in a tough spot, calling 911, if it's an emergency, and letting them know, here's my situation. I am someone who's blind and need assistance, evacuating, whatever that situation might be. And Ryan, you might be able to add more context to that, working also in the response side as well, if you've got any insight there.
No, I think again, just nailed it, Monika. If we know there's a situation where there's a person with a disability that can't physically get themselves out of harm's way, I've seen, our first responder teams go above and beyond to try to help that individual or family with those situations. And I think the idea of a list or something like that, it sounds good in theory, but in practice, like you said, it just becomes a little bit unwieldy at times, and it's hard to maintain. And I think, if there's an emergency, you have to call 911, and that's the best way to handle it at the time.
Yeah. Well, because you wouldn't want to send someone out based on a list and find that they had moved, or
right, because there's limited resources available to get people out in those situations. So relying on a list probably is not the best way to go about it.
Yeah. So that's just good for people to know. Like,
Yeah.
you need to prepare with your own resources to be sustainable, but then to call 911 if you need to in a situation. I know, Ryan, one of the primary reasons you're joining us today is to talk to us about what happens after the disaster, after, you've evacuated and the storm has ended, the flood has ended, or, a storm. That recovery process, because that can be really, really lengthy, as we saw with, the fires in Superior and people needing to rebuild and all of those types of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when the dust settles, for lack of a better way of saying it, we start really thinking about what's going to be the new normal. And I think what's important for folks to understand is it's a marathon, not a sprint. And they need to really prioritize taking care of themselves and their families as soon as they get started on what we would call, the journey to the new normal or long-term recovery. So when people are allowed back, the first thing that they want to know is my property safe? Is it there? Right. So everybody's really anxious to get back. And the first thing we want to make sure is that we're asking people not to go back too soon, because it might not be safe, right? The roads might not be cleared. The power lines might still be down. So there's crews out there working to get those routes reopened, power restored, and so forth. And just to be patient with the response teams out there they're working 24/7 to get that done. So on the private side, say you had damage to your home, you're thinking, okay, what's next? Well, you're going to have to document those damages for your insurance company, right? And what we saw in the Marshall Fire, unfortunately, was it was reported that 2/3 to up to 3/4 of the homes that were impacted by the Marshall Fire were underinsured. And that was due to a number of different circumstances: inflation, rising construction costs, and sadly, just outdated policies that didn't reflect the actual cost of what it would take to rebuild a home in 2021, 2022, 2023. So I think as a preparedness measure, it's really incumbent upon folks to look at their policies, making sure that they do have adequate coverage in the event that something like this happens. It's not just for catastrophic incidents like the Marshall Fire. This could happen to any one of your neighbors at any given time. It's not just about a big wildfire, right? And those financial impacts could be severe. So, yeah, make sure you understand your policy, work with your insurance provider to make sure you have adequate insurance so that in the event of an incident that you can cover yourself financially.
Yeah, even something that's just in your own home, whether it's a fire or a water line pipe breaks, or you have some kind of damage that it's confined. It's not a natural disaster necessarily, but for insurance purposes, all of that's important.
Yeah, insurance is your number one resource in terms of making yourself financially whole after an incident. There's a lot of other resources out there like FEMA and the SBA that will help, but those programs aren't intended to make you whole, and they unfortunately just won't. So having that private insurance is critical. What
role does FEMA play? Like, what should people expect? I think we've seen that now with hurricanes and people being upset with FEMA, not thinking they're responding enough. And yet, again, they have some limitations if roads are out and things like that. But what should people expect from FEMA as opposed to, maybe local resources or obviously their own insurance?
Yeah, sure. Monika, do you want to take what FEMA's role is on the response side, and I can talk about maybe on the longer term recovery side?
I can try to. Yeah, I think my experience, I have yet to be in a FEMA involved incident, I guess, luckily for myself.
Yeah, that's good.
But really coming in and, helping, I think with the funding part is how I think, at least I understand it. I know they will also bring out incident management teams as well and coordinate that, I think.
Yeah.
This isn't probably super usable audio. I will try to reframe that in a less uncertain way. Here we go. FEMA's role is really coming in and helping to back some of the financial piece, and then also bringing out incident management teams to help manage an incident, because when local resources are burnt out, right, we only have so many personnel kind of on our bench. They help to, supplement or add to that so that folks can have a little bit of that relief on the kind of response side and folks managing the incident. Is from my limited experience, my understanding of kind of their role and how they would be involved in some of our larger disasters. And they're not involved in every disaster as well. So unless it hits that federal declaration level, it's staying at either local officials, or if it rises above that, state, in terms of some of those funding sources and supports. But it's kind of a tiered system for when FEMA gets involved.
That's right, Monika. So we have a saying in this industry, it's disasters begin and end locally. So it's really the role of the local and state governments to manage their disasters until local and state resources are overwhelmed. And once that occurs, the state can request federal assistance through FEMA. And in times where, there's like a hurricane where you have a few days to pre-position resources, FEMA has the authority, once that declaration is made, to go in and help with that effort. On the longer term recovery side, there's a number of programs that FEMA offers. FEMA Public Assistance is their largest grant program, and that is for financial assistance for public infrastructure. So we've had a number of FEMA Public Assistance grants throughout the years to help rebuild roads, bridges, other public facilities that have been damaged in our recent disaster events that have occurred the last 10, 15 years. On the personal side, or the private side, they have what's called FEMA Individual Assistance, and that's a program to help individuals and families with immediate needs following a large-scale disaster. And that's a financial program that FEMA will offer financial assistance to folks for that.
Okay. And in terms of dealing with your insurance and trying to recover when it is a large disaster, a widespread disaster like the Marshall Fire or like a hurricane, there's a lot of damage. Are there resources available to help people while they're, obviously, if you have to rebuild your home, that's not going to happen overnight. But resources if they need to temporarily relocate, and what they can expect in that process, or forms that they need to fill out, things like that, because it can be quite a lengthy process.
Yeah, absolutely, Kim. So when the shelters start to shut down, FEMA and the state and local governments will typically set up what we call FEMA Disaster Recovery Centers, or on the local side, we call them Disaster Assistance Centers, for folks to come, and then we'll have a host of different resources available at these centers to help folks begin getting back on their feet again. In our experience here at the Marshall Fire, we've had the Disaster Recovery Center, the FEMA Disaster Recovery Center, and our Disaster Assistance Center co-located in one of our county buildings. And I think that really helped, because we had all the resources in one place. Folks could come in, they could stop at the FEMA desk, they can stop at the local permitting office desk, they can speak with the SBA or any other critical documentation that they needed to get replaced, all in this one physical location. And we really believe that having that helps folks get on their feet much quicker than it otherwise would be.
If individuals have difficulty with their insurance companies, do you have any suggestions or advice on that? I know that's like outside of something that a city or county can control, but is there advice for that?
Yeah, it's really out of our purview, but what we saw in the Marshall Fire was regulatory agencies like the Colorado Division of Insurance and other advocacy groups like the United Policyholders really come together and provide resources to the impacted residents that really put a host of information out there so that people had access. And if there were insurance companies that weren't cooperating with their policyholders, and I don't know too much about what happened on the individual level, but I know that there were resources out there for those folks that were impacted.
Yeah. United Policyholders has got some really good information as well. If people are kind of wondering, what am I supposed to talk to my insurance provider about, or what things can I do kind of on that proactive side before a disaster?
Mm-hmm.
They've got a lot of good kind of guiding documents and things. A couple quick pulls from that are just making sure to chat with your provider. But that's something that you can do in your home that can make a difference, is documenting things, whether that is maintaining a list of like updates or upgrades to your property that you've made. Some folks will say to take video or photos of just the inside of your home and outside of your home, just so you have some kind of tangible thing to be able to provide as documentation. Because what we found from folks that lost homes in the Marshall Fire is, they said, well, gosh, we don't really remember what all was in here, and they didn't realize, oh my gosh, we lost this thing. We didn't think about it till a year later when we were looking for it and needed it. So having sometimes those things that, someone in your household can say, great, I'm going to wander around, I'm going to take a video of everything. And then you have that for your home.
That inventory list.
Documenting things. And it's something that folks can not just have to keep a list, because goodness, how long would that list be if you're going to list out every, item, piece of furniture, update, whatever. It creates kind of a more succinct resource to be able to have that documented.
Yeah. And even to document maybe, not that you could necessarily open every box in your basement or a storage area, but just like some of those things too that you might only pull out once a year for special occasions, or, for a vacation that you're not using every day, to be sure you don't forget those things.
Harkening back to one of those ideas that we talked about, I think one of the last times was a grab list. If you have some items that you're like, gosh, this is really sentimental to me and important, and I normally keep it in this kind of odd storage situation, that might be something that you say, what, I am going to pull this out and make sure it's in some location in my home that is more accessible to me. So if I needed to leave, it could be part of my grab list, and I don't have to go, going through boxes and hoping to find it when you have that high stress, but rather, great, it's in this closet near the entryway, and everyone in the home knows, great, this is on the list of things to take with us.
That's great. Well, I know you've both mentioned that shelters, recovery centers, all are, at least they're trying to be fully accessible. Again, with individual insurance companies and forms and things, that's something you'd have to advocate for, I guess, with your insurance company if there are difficulties there. But hopefully an agent would be able to help with that. For at least for folks that have, some vision loss and might not be able to sit down and just fill out a form or sit down to the computer and fill one out. Is there anything else that either of you would like to let our listeners know, or a tip or advice, or a cautionary tale that you've seen play out that you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap it up?
I would say, I think when it comes to the recovery, just those tips about documenting things ahead of time and really talking with your provider about what does a full loss look like and what's my coverage look like compared to that. What does it cost to rebuild, and making sure that you update that policy on an annual or otherwise regular basis, I think is a huge lesson learned, and I'm grateful that folks that have gone through that difficulty have shared that with us, because it allows us to share it with you now. So hopefully you don't have to, if you're listening to this, be someone that is in that situation. So I'd say do that, and, take your preparedness steps ahead of time, because that's always going to help us all get through it a little less scathed. I don't know if that's a word. Help us to get out of a disaster more unscathed than not, if you take those preparedness steps and can try to focus in on that ahead of time.
Absolutely, yeah. And just understand your risks. I don't think I ever imagined the Marshall Fire happening in Boulder County, and look where we are. So there's more and more resources becoming available to help folks understand what their real risk is. And I hope that will help people make informed decisions around, insurance and other items.
Well, thank you both for being here and providing this information to us. It's so important, and it's information you want ahead of time and not when you're in the midst of a situation or a disaster.
Certainly.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you missed some of the earlier episodes that talk in more detail about, preparing things ahead of time, those are available. Definitely go back and listen to those or about evacuation, so that you can get some of that additional information on what you might want to think about or what you might want to keep in a go bag to be able to take with you. And just the advice that we've heard today about checking your insurance coverage and knowing what you have in case you ever had to show evidence of your possessions for insurance purposes. And we just thank you guys and the others in your offices and in the field, the first responders that do come out and help us, especially folks that might be older or have a disability, that in those disaster situations, it just adds an extra barrier for folks at times. So we appreciate all the work you do as well. So next, as we wrap up emergency preparedness, we will be launching an 8-week series on the holidays and preparing for the holidays and all different kinds of topics. So everything from mental health and dealing with your family at holidays, travel tips, decorating. We're going to start with talking to the Aftersight staff about family traditions and things that we all do. And hopefully you can share some of your family traditions with us as well. We would love to know what your traditions are, and you can contact us at contact@aftersight.org if you would like to share information with us about your family traditions, or if you have any questions about what we've talked about today or this month on emergency preparedness, please let us know, and we can reach out to get answers for you. So thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to talking about holidays. Think about your emergency preparedness. We hope all this information has helped you navigate your life with vision loss.